The lecture hall fell silent as Professor Velcor activated the holographic display. Images of burning cities and devastated worlds filled the air above the assembled students. The Galactic Ethics Academy on Centauri Prime was known throughout the civilized systems as the premier institution for teaching interstellar law and moral philosophy. Today's class brought together students from 40 different species, each representing their civilization's brightest minds. War, Professor Velcor began, his crystalline form refracting the light from the holograms, is the ultimate test of a species' ethical foundation. Today we examine the Kryn-Valdor conflict, a war that ended 3 cycles ago and claimed 17 billion lives. The students shifted in their seats, their various forms of note-taking devices already recording every word. Among them sat Kayla Morrison, the only human in the advanced ethics course. She was smaller than most of her classmates, her plain features and simple clothing making her almost invisible among the exotic appearances of her peers. Most species barely noticed humans yet. Humanity had only joined the galactic community 15 years ago, and they were still considered newcomers, primitives who had barely mastered faster-than-light travel. Kayla watched as the hologram shifted to show Kryn warships bombarding a Valdor colony world. The professor's voice carried across the amphitheater with practiced authority. The Kryn initiated this conflict after the Valdor refused to share their newly discovered energy technology. The Kryn argued that hoarding such advancement violated the principle of collective progress. Were they justified? A Threxian student, his 6 arms gesturing enthusiastically, spoke first. The Kryn were absolutely justified. The Galactic Charter clearly states that discoveries benefiting all species must be shared. The Valdor's refusal was selfish and violated established law. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the class. Professor Velcor nodded, encouraging more discussion. A Centauri student spoke next, her tone measured and diplomatic. However, the Valdor sovereignty over their own discoveries must be considered. They developed this technology independently. Does the Charter truly give others the right to demand it through force? The debate intensified as more students joined in. Most agreed that while the Kryn's methods were harsh, their fundamental position was correct. After all, the Galactic Council had sided with the Kryn in the post-war tribunals. The Valdor leadership had been executed for crimes against collective progress. This was settled history, a clear case study in applied ethics. Kayla listened quietly, her expression troubled. She had read extensively about this conflict, accessing databases that most students ignored. The official records told one story, but the deeper archives revealed something else entirely. The casualty reports, the economic data, the cultural destruction. Something about this entire discussion felt wrong to her, but she hesitated to speak. She was still learning how things worked in galactic society. Professor Velcor continued, clearly pleased with the class consensus.
Excellent analysis.
This case perfectly demonstrates how the greater good must sometimes override individual sovereignty. The Council's decision to— Excuse me, Professor. Kayla's voice was quiet, but something in her tone cut through the discussion like a blade. Every sensor, eye and sensory organ in the room turned toward her. Professor Velcor's crystalline body shifted colors slightly, indicating surprise. Yes, Student Morrison? You have a question? Not a question, Kayla said, standing up slowly. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. A problem. This entire discussion is based on a false premise. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Several students made sounds that translated to disbelief or amusement. The Threxian who had spoken earlier laughed outright. The human objects. On what grounds? This case was decided by the Council itself. Kayla pulled up her datapad, projecting her own set of files into the shared holographic space. I accessed the deep archives, the ones marked for historical research. The Valdor energy technology wasn't just some power source. It was based on their sacred geometry, their religious mathematics. It was the foundation of their entire spiritual practice for 12,000 years. Professor Velcor's color shifted to a defensive yellow. Cultural sensitivity is admirable, Student Morrison, but it doesn't override the practical needs of— The Kryn didn't want the technology for practical needs, Kayla interrupted, her voice growing stronger. 3 months before the war started, Kryn industrial corporations filed patents for similar technology. They were in a commercial race. When the Valdor refused to share, it wasn't about helping the galaxy. It was about profit margins and corporate advantage. The room erupted into protests. Speculation, someone shouted. Human ignorance, called another. But Kayla wasn't finished. She pulled up more files, her fingers moving rapidly across her datapad. The Galactic Council that judged this case, she continued, speaking over the noise, was composed of 7 species. 5 of them had significant economic agreements with Kryn corporations. The 2 who voted against the war declaration were removed from the council within a year on unrelated corruption charges that were never proven. The judge who sentenced the Valdor leadership? His clan received a development contract on one of the conquered Valdor worlds 6 months after the verdict. Professor Velkor's form now pulsed in angry orange. Student Morrison, you are making extremely serious accusations without... I'm reading from official records. Kayla's voice finally rose, echoing through the amphitheater. Everything I'm saying is documented. It's all there in the archives. You just have to actually look past the sanitized summaries. A Zentari student stood up, her voice icy with disdain. Even if your conspiracy theories were true, the fundamental ethics remain unchanged. The technology would have benefited billions of beings. The Valdor's stubbornness cost lives. Kayla turned to face her directly. No, the Kryn's invasion cost lives. 17 billion lives, as the professor mentioned. But the records also show that 8 billion of those were Valdor civilians who refused to surrender their holy sites where the technology originated. They chose death over desecration. The Kryn bombed temples, schools, and hospitals because those places held the mathematical formulae. She pulled up image after image, documented evidence that most students had never seen. The Valdor offered 17 times to share the technology's practical applications while protecting their spiritual texts. The Kryn refused every compromise. They wanted everything, including the right to commercialize sacred teachings. The lecture hall had gone completely silent now. Even the professor seemed at a loss for words. Kayla's hands trembled slightly, but she pressed on. So I ask you, all of you, before we declare this a simple ethics case about the greater good versus sovereignty, whose definition of good are we using? The Kryns, who profited? The councils, who had financial stakes? The historical record written by the victors? She paused, looking around at dozens of alien faces staring at her. Or should we maybe consider that the Valdor, who are now almost extinct as a culture, might have had their own valid ethical framework that we simply erased because it was inconvenient? The silence stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable. Then slowly, a Corvin student in the back raised one of his tentacles. I never considered the Valdor perspective was missing from the records. That's because it is missing, Kayla said quietly, sitting back down. They don't have enough survivors left to write their version. Professor Velkor stood motionless, his color cycling through patterns that indicated deep thought. Outside the windows, Centauri Prime's twin suns cast long shadows across the academy grounds. The class session had taken an unexpected turn, and somewhere in the uncomfortable quiet, every student felt the foundation of their assumptions beginning to crack. The hours after class felt strange to Kayla. Students who normally ignored her now stared as she walked through the academy corridors. Some looks were hostile, others curious, a few thoughtful. She kept her head down and made her way to the library archives, where she spent most of her free time anyway. The massive structure housed data crystals containing millions of years of galactic history. Though Kayla had discovered that much of it was carefully curated, she found her usual corner workstation and settled in, pulling up more research files. Her hands still shook slightly from the confrontation in class. She hadn't planned to speak up like that. Back on Earth, her professors had warned her that humans needed to be careful in galactic society. They were new, weak, and easily dismissed. Don't make waves, her advisor had said. Learn the system first, but Kayla couldn't help it. When she saw injustice dressed up as ethics, something inside her refused to stay silent. Maybe it was her upbringing in New Ghana, where her grandmother had taught her that truth spoken in the face of power was never wasted, even when it seemed to accomplish nothing. Student Morrison. Kayla jumped, nearly knocking over her data tablet. Professor Velkor stood behind her, his crystalline form now a neutral blue-white. She stood quickly, expecting to be expelled or at least severely reprimanded. Professor, I apologize if I was disrespectful in class. You should have nothing, Velkor interrupted, his voice lacking its usual authoritative edge. May I sit? Kayla nodded, confused. The professor materialized a chair from the library's matter synthesizer and positioned himself across from her. Up close, she could see the complex internal structures of his crystalline biology, light bending and refracting through his form in mesmerizing patterns. I have been teaching ethics at this academy for 43 cycles. Velcor began quietly. I have taught thousands of students from hundreds of species. Do you know how many have challenged the core curriculum the way you did today? Kyla shook her head. 3. Only 3, including yourself. And you are the first to support your challenge with verifiable documentation. He paused, his color shifting to something Kayla couldn't quite interpret. The Kryn-Valdor case has been taught as settled history for years. I taught it the way I was taught, the way the official curriculum presented it. You didn't know? Kayla asked carefully. I knew there were archived materials I hadn't reviewed, Velcor admitted. But why would I question the Council's judgment? They are wise ancient beings who have maintained galactic peace for thousands of years. Or so we tell ourselves. He pulled up his own holographic display, showing the same files Kayla had presented. After class, I accessed the deep archives. Everything you said was accurate. More than accurate. You barely scratched the surface. The economic manipulation, the political maneuvering, the systematic erasure of Valdor culture. It's all documented, all available to anyone who bothers to look beyond the summary texts. Kayla felt a chill run down her spine. Then why doesn't anyone look? Because the system doesn't want us to, Velcor said simply. The Galactic Council maintains order through consensus. Consensus requires shared narratives. Shared narratives require simplified histories. And simplified histories require that uncomfortable truths be archived rather than taught. He stood up, pacing in front of the workstation. The Kryn are one of the most powerful species in the Council. They provide defense technology to 40% of galactic civilizations. Their economic influence touches nearly every system. To question their war justifications is to question the entire power structure that maintains galactic stability. So we just accept lies? Kayla asked, her voice harder than she intended. We call it ethics while we're really just teaching politics? Until today, I would have said we were teaching practical morality, Velcor replied. The ethics of maintaining order in a galaxy of 1,000 competing civilizations? Now I'm not certain what I've been teaching. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Kayla asked the question that had been bothering her since she started at the academy. Why do you think humans see these things differently? Velcor's color shifted to contemplative purple. I've been considering that question. Your species is young on the galactic stage. You haven't been fully integrated into our consensus reality yet. You still ask questions that the rest of us learned to stop asking generations ago. Or maybe, Kayla said carefully, we've had to ask harder questions. Earth's history is full of powerful civilizations claiming moral authority while committing atrocities. We've been the Valdor. We've been the victims of empires that called conquest progress and genocide civilization. Maybe we're just better at recognizing the patterns. Velcor considered this for a long moment. Your planet fought 2 massive wars within a single century, correct? Wars that nearly destroyed your entire species? World War I and II, yes. Plus countless smaller conflicts, colonial occupations, ethnic cleansings. Kayla's voice was quiet. We nearly killed ourselves learning that power doesn't equal righteousness. That the winners writing history doesn't make their version true. And yet here in the galaxy, we've had relative peace for 5,000 years, Velcor said. Doesn't that suggest our system works better than yours did? Peace for who? Kayla challenged. The Valdor had peace before the Kryn decided they wanted their technology. The Harmonic Collective had peace before the Council decided their refusal to use violence made them unsuitable for self-governance. The Stellar Nomads had peace before they were declared security risks and confined to reservation zones. She pulled up file after file. I've found 17 species in the last century alone that experienced what you call integration conflicts. They're all either extinct, reduced to protectorate status, or so culturally decimated they barely remember their own histories. Velcor's form flickered, a sign of deep distress in his species. You've only been here for 4 months. How have you found all of this? Because I was looking, Kayla said simply. Everyone else takes classes on ethics and law and assumes the galaxy is basically fair. I took classes after spending 3 weeks reading nothing but casualty reports and archived testimonies from species that don't exist anymore. The patterns are obvious once you see them. The professor sat back down heavily. What you're describing is systematic injustice on a galactic scale. If true, it would mean the entire council structure is corrupt. It would mean everything we teach here is propaganda. Not everything, Kayla said more gently. The principles are sound. The logic frameworks are useful. But they're being applied selectively to justify predetermined conclusions. That's not ethics. That's just politics with better vocabulary. Velcor sat in silence for several minutes, his internal light patterns moving in complex configurations. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, more uncertain than Kayla had ever heard from a professor. If you're correct, if even half of what you suggest is true, then what am I supposed to do? I can't simply tell my students that the council is corrupt. I can't announce that our entire civilization's moral framework is built on convenient lies. The chaos alone would— You could start by teaching critical thinking instead of consensus, Kayla interrupted. Stop presenting cases as settled. Show students how to access deep archives. Teach them to ask whose ethics. When someone claims moral authority, they would likely fire me, Velcor said quietly. They might, Kayla agreed. But isn't that the question ethics is supposed to answer? What do we do when speaking truth costs us something? The professor stood up again, his color cycling through patterns Kayla couldn't fully read. You're remarkably brave for someone so young and so alone here. I'm not brave, Kayla said honestly. I'm just stubborn. My grandmother used to say that sometimes the only way to honor those who were silenced is to refuse to be silent yourself. The Valdor can't speak for themselves anymore. Someone has to. Velcor moved toward the archive exit, then paused. Student Morrison, I should warn you. What happened in class today will not go unnoticed. There are those on the faculty and in the Council Oversight Committee who will not appreciate your questions. The Academy exists to train the next generation of galactic administrators and judges. It does not exist to train revolutionaries. I'm not trying to start a revolution, Kayla said. I'm just trying to learn real ethics, not convenient ones. Those may be the same thing, Velcor replied. Then he left, his crystalline form refracting the library lights into rainbow patterns on the walls. Kayla sat alone in her corner, surrounded by data crystals containing the forgotten histories of extinct species. She thought about her grandmother, about Earth's own bloody history, about all the times powerful civilizations had declared themselves the arbiters of right and wrong. The galaxy wasn't so different from human history. It was just older, more established, and better at hiding its sins. Her datapad chimed with a message notification. Multiple messages, actually. She opened them cautiously. Most were hate mail from other students calling her arrogant, ignorant, a primitive human who didn't understand galactic civilization. But 3 messages were different. 3 students thanking her for speaking up, for saying things they'd thought but never dared to voice. One message stood out. The summons arrived 3 days after Kayla's confrontation in ethics class. A formal holographic message materialized above her dorm room desk, bearing the seal of the Academy's Administrative Council. She was to appear before Dean Korthax in his office within 2 standard hours. The message specified no reason, but Kayla had a pretty good idea what this was about. She dressed carefully in her formal academy uniform, the dark blue suit that marked her as a second-year student. The human delegation on Zentari Prime had been very specific about protocols and respect for authority. You're representing all of humanity, they'd told her before she started. Every action you take reflects on Earth. The weight of that responsibility had never felt heavier than it did walking through the Academy's administrative wing. The corridors here were different from the student areas, decorated with artifacts from founding species and portraits of famous graduates who had gone on to become council justices, planetary governors, and ethical advisors to civilizations spanning 1,000 worlds. Dean Korthax's office occupied the top floor of the central tower. His secretary, a Metherian with skin that shifted colors based on electromagnetic fields, barely glanced at Kayla before gesturing her toward the massive doors. They slid open silently, revealing an office that seemed designed to intimidate. The room was circular, with windows offering a panoramic view of the Academy grounds and the gleaming cityscape beyond. Shelves lined the walls, filled with legal texts and ethical treatises from every major galactic civilization. In the center, behind a desk carved from a single piece of Valorian crystal, sat Dean Korthax himself. The dean was a Zentari elder, his silver skin marked with the intricate patterns that denoted high social status among his people. His 4 eyes focused on Kayla with an intensity that made her feel like a microorganism under examination. He didn't invite her to sit. "Student Morrison," he began, his voice carrying the harmonics that marked formal address in Zentari culture. "Do you understand why you've been summoned?" "I assume it concerns my statements in Professor Velkor's ethics class," Kayla replied, keeping her voice respectful but steady. "Your disruption of Professor Velkor's class," Korthax corrected. "Your presentation of unverified conspiracy theories. Your disrespectful questioning of established council judgments." He leaned forward slightly. "Need I continue?" "The information I presented was from official archives," Kayla said carefully. "Everything was verified and documented. I didn't fabricate anything." "Selective presentation of data can be as misleading as fabrication," the dean countered. "You cherry-picked controversial materials while ignoring the broader context. The Kryn-Valdor conflict was extensively reviewed by the finest legal minds in the galaxy. Your insinuation that they were all corrupt or incompetent is both arrogant and dangerous." Kayla felt anger rising but forced it down. Getting emotional wouldn't help. "I didn't say they were incompetent. I pointed out that they had conflicts of interest that should have been disclosed. That's basic ethical practice even by the Academy's own standards." Korthax's skin patterns shifted to a darker shade, indicating displeasure. "You are a human. Your species has been part of the galactic community for barely 15 rotations. You have no experience with the complexities of maintaining order among thousands of civilizations, yet you presume to lecture your peers on ethics as if you possess superior moral authority." "I don't claim superior moral authority," Kayla said, her jaw tightening. "I claim the right to ask questions. Isn't that what education is supposed to be about? Education is about learning established wisdom, not questioning it at every turn," Korthax replied sharply. "There is a reason we teach consensus-based ethics. The alternative is chaos. Every species believing their moral framework supersedes all others. That path leads to constant conflict. Or maybe," Kayla said, her voice growing stronger despite herself, "consensus ethics just means the most powerful species get to decide what's right, and everyone else has to go along with it. The Valdor didn't have much choice in the consensus, did they? Neither did the 17 other species I've found that were integrated after refusing to comply with council decisions." The dean stood up abruptly, his full height making Kayla feel very small. "Enough, I did not summon you here to debate galactic politics. I summoned you to inform you that you are on probation. One more disruption, one more unauthorized presentation of controversial materials, and you will be expelled from the Academy." Kayla's heart sank, but she kept her expression neutral. "Unauthorized? Are students not allowed to access official archives? Students are expected to focus on approved curriculum materials," Korthax said coldly. "The deep archives exist for advanced researchers with proper context and guidance, not for second-year students looking to make inflammatory statements. So we're only supposed to learn what you decide is appropriate for us to know?" "Yes," Korthax said simply, his tone making it clear this was not up for discussion. "That is literally the definition of education. Curated knowledge presented in appropriate context by those qualified to teach it." A long silence filled the office. Kayla thought about arguing further, about pointing out the circular logic, about mentioning that this was exactly how civilizations hid their crimes. But she could see it in the dean's posture, in the set of his jaw. This wasn't a conversation. It was a warning. "I understand," she said finally. "Good." Korthax sat back down, his skin patterns lightening slightly. "You are a promising student, Morrison. Your grades are excellent. Your analytical skills are impressive for someone of your age and species. Don't throw away this opportunity because of misguided idealism." "Is it misguided to want ethical education to be actually ethical?" The dean's eyes narrowed. "That attitude is exactly what concerns me. You believe you understand ethics better than civilizations that have practiced them for millions of years? That level of arrogance is dangerous." "It's not arrogance to notice inconsistencies," Kayla said quietly. "It's just pattern recognition." "Then let me give you a pattern to recognize," Korthax said, his voice dropping to something almost threatening. "Every species that has joined the galactic community has gone through an adjustment period. They arrive thinking their ways are special, their perspectives unique. They question, they resist, they imagine, they see problems that ancient civilizations somehow missed. And every single one eventually learns that the system works because we maintain order, not because we're perfect. He stood up again, moving to the window. Humans are not the first young species to join us, Morrison. You're not even the most difficult. The Kreveks were far more resistant. They refused to accept council authority for decades. Do you know what happened to them? Kayla didn't answer, but she knew. The Kreveks were extinct. Their homeworld quarantined after a plague that official records claimed was natural. The deep archives suggested otherwise. They learned too late that resistance to galactic order is futile. Korthax continued. I would hate for humanity to learn that same lesson. I would especially hate for that lesson to begin with a bright young student who couldn't control her need to question everything. The threat was clear. Kayla wasn't just risking her own future. She was potentially endangering Earth's position in the galactic community. The weight of that realization pressed down on her like a physical force. I'm not trying to cause problems for humanity, she said, her voice smaller than before. Then stop acting like you are, Korthax replied. He returned to his desk, pulling up a holographic display. Your next class is Advanced Interspecies Conflict Resolution, correct? Professor Thane teaches that course. She is very traditional, very by the book. I suggest you remember that. Yes, Dean. You may go. Kayla turned to leave, her legs feeling unsteady. She was halfway to the door when Korthax spoke again, his voice softer but somehow more disturbing. One more thing, Student Morrison. Your correspondence with the remaining Valdor students has been noted. I would suggest limiting such contact. The Valdor are sensitive about their history. Your questions might give them false hope that the Council's decisions can be revisited. That would be cruel, don't you think? To make them believe justice might still be possible when we both know it isn't. Kayla's hand froze on the door panel. You monitor student communications? We monitor everything, Korthax said simply. For safety, for order, for the good of all species in the Academy. Surely you understand? She understood perfectly. She was being watched. Every message, every research query, every conversation was being recorded and analyzed. The Academy wasn't just teaching ethics. It was enforcing conformity. Kayla left the office without another word, her mind racing. She walked through the corridors in a daze, barely noticing other students moving around her. By the time she reached the gardens outside, she was shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. She found an empty bench near a fountain, the sound of water helping to calm her racing thoughts. Everything the dean had said made a horrible kind of sense. The galaxy was vast, complex, full of competing interests and ancient grudges. Maybe maintaining order really did require some level of, she struggled for the word, authoritarianism? Thought control? But then she remembered the Valdor student's message. Thank you for remembering us. She thought about the 17 billion dead, the cultures erased, the questions never asked because asking was dangerous. Her datapad buzzed. Another message, this one from Professor Velcor. Meet me at the Historical Archives, Section 7. Come alone. Delete this message. Kayla stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it as instructed. She stood up, looking around to see if anyone was watching her. She couldn't tell. Maybe that was the point. She started walking toward the archives, her heart pounding. She knew this was probably a terrible idea. The dean had just threatened her, warned her, made it clear that continuing down this path could end her career and possibly endanger her entire species. The smart thing would be to keep her head down, finish her education, go home to Earth, and forget everything she'd learned. But Kayla had never been particularly good at doing the smart thing when the right thing was different. Her grandmother would have been proud of that at least. Or maybe horrified. Probably both. The historical archives loomed ahead, its ancient structure a reminder that some knowledge was considered too dangerous for easy access. Kayla took a deep breath and walked inside, hoping she wasn't making the biggest mistake of her life. Section 7 of the historical archives was different from the public areas where Kayla usually studied. The air here felt heavier, charged with some quality she couldn't quite identify. Older, maybe. The data crystals in this section predated the current council by thousands of years, containing records from civilizations that existed before humanity even understood fire. Professor Velcor waited for her near a massive crystalline wall that seemed to pulse with inner light. His form was a muted gray, a color Kayla had learned indicated secrecy or concealment in his species. When he saw her approach, he activated a privacy field around them. The ambient sounds of the archive suddenly muffled as if they were standing inside a bubble. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. "I wasn't certain you would. Dean Korthak summoned me," Kayla said. "He made it very clear that I'm being watched. This meeting is probably already being flagged by security systems." "Almost certainly," Velcor agreed, "which is why I've taken precautions." He gestured to a device attached to his form, a small metallic disc that Kayla didn't recognize. A signal scrambler. Illegal to possess on Academy grounds, which should tell you how serious this conversation is. Kayla felt her pulse quicken. "Professor, I don't want you to risk your position because of my position." Velcor's color shifted to something almost amused. "Student Morrison, I have been teaching at this academy for 4 decades. In that time, I have trained senators, judges, ethical advisors to the council itself. I truly believed that I was serving the cause of justice." His form flickered. "After our conversation in the library, I spent 3 days doing nothing but reading. The deep archives, the restricted files, the records that I never bothered to examine because I trusted the system." "What did you find?" Kayla asked, though part of her already knew. "Everything you suggested and worse," Velcor said heavily. "The Kryn-Valdor conflict was not an isolated case. It's a pattern repeated dozens of times across recorded history. A powerful species identifies resources or technology they want. They manufacture an ethical justification. The council, whose members benefit from cooperation with that species, provides legal cover. Opposition is crushed, often with extreme violence. The survivors are integrated into the system, their children taught that their ancestors were wrong to resist." He pulled up a holographic display, images flowing past so quickly Kayla could barely process them. "The Harmonic Collective, pacifists who refused to develop weapons technology, declared a security risk and placed under permanent council protection, which means military occupation. The Stellar Nomads, who traveled freely between systems without recognizing territorial boundaries, confined to reservations for disrupting established trade routes. The Melodic Spheres, whose entire civilization existed as energy patterns in a nebula, harvested for fuel after being declared non-sentient by a council investigation that lasted 6 days. Kayla felt sick. 6 days? To determine if an entire species was sentient? The council needed the nebula's energy for an expansion project, Velcor said bitterly. The investigation was a formality. The decision was already made. His color shifted through several patterns, each indicating a different emotion too complex for Kayla to fully understand. "I taught the Melodic Spheres case in my advanced ethics seminar. Taught it as a difficult but necessary choice. Taught students that sometimes uncertain sentience must yield to certain needs." "You didn't know," Kayla said softly. "I didn't want to know," Velcor corrected. "That's different. The information was available. I simply chose to trust the curriculum, trust the system, trust that beings wiser than myself had made difficult decisions I didn't need to second-guess." He looked directly at Kayla, his 4 eyes focusing with uncomfortable intensity. "Do you understand what you've done? You, a human barely out of adolescence by galactic standards, have destroyed my faith in the very foundations of our civilization." "I'm sorry," Kayla said. "And meant it." "Don't be," Velcor replied. "I needed it destroyed. We all do." He manipulated the holographic display, zooming in on a particular file. "This is why I asked you here. I found something in the archives that I think you need to see." The image that appeared made Kayla's blood run cold. It was a report, classified at the highest levels, dated 7 months before humanity's first contact with the galactic community. The title read, "Strategic Assessment, Earth and Associated Territories." "They were watching us," Kayla breathed. "Before first contact, before we even knew they existed." "For 53 years, Velcor confirmed, since your species first developed nuclear capabilities. The Council has protocols for managing emerging civilizations. Humanity was designated a Tier 4 development risk." "What does that mean?" "It means you were watched, analyzed, and judged," Velcor said. "The Council identified Earth as potentially troublesome. Your species' history of warfare, resistance to centralized authority, tendency toward independent thought. All of it was documented and assessed." Kayla scrolled through the report, her hands shaking. Pages and pages of analysis on human psychology, culture, political structures. Recommendations for how to integrate humanity into galactic society while minimizing the risk of ideological contamination. "Ideological contamination," Kayla read aloud. "They were afraid of human ideas spreading. Specifically, your concepts of individual rights, democratic governance, and questioning authority, Velcor said. The Council operates on consensus and hierarchy. Human philosophy is fundamentally incompatible with that structure. The report recommends careful management of human integration to prevent your species from destabilizing established order. Kayla found a section marked in red, indicating high priority. She read it aloud, her voice hollow. Recommendation 17. Limit human access to historical archives for minimum 50 standard cycles. Ensure initial generation of human scholars is trained exclusively by Council-approved instructors using standard curriculum. Monitor human students for signs of systematic questioning or pattern recognition that might lead to discovery of integration protocols used on other species. They knew, Kayla said, looking up at Velcor. They knew that if humans saw what happened to other species, we'd recognize it. We'd resist. Your species has experienced being colonized, Velcor said quietly. Your history is full of empires claiming moral authority while committing atrocities. The Council recognized that humans would see through the ethical language to the power dynamics underneath. That's why your access to education is being carefully controlled. Kayla sat down heavily on a nearby bench, her mind reeling. The Dean's threats. The monitoring. The restrictions on what archives I can access. It's all part of the plan. They're not just punishing me for speaking up. They're containing a potential problem. You specifically were flagged in quarterly reports, Velcor said, pulling up another document. Your pattern of research, your questions in class, your contact with marginalized species. Security algorithms identified you as a level 3 ideological risk 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks? But I only spoke up in your class 3 days ago. They knew you would, Velcor said. The algorithms predict behavior based on research patterns and psychological profiles. They calculated a 92% probability that you would eventually challenge official narratives publicly. Dean Korthax's meeting with you wasn't reactive. It was preventive. Kayla felt like the floor was dropping away beneath her. So what happens now? They expel me, send me back to Earth as a warning to other humans? Possibly, Velcor said. Or they might try something more subtle. Discredit you academically. Arrange for you to fail courses. Make your continued education so difficult that you quit voluntarily. The Council prefers soft power when possible. Martyrdom creates problems, and then why are you showing me this? Kayla asked. If they're watching, if they're planning to remove me anyway, why risk yourself? Velcor's color shifted to a deep blue, something that Kayla had learned indicated determination or resolve in his species. Because I spent 40 years teaching lies. Because I trained generations of students to accept injustice as ethics. Because when I look at the species that have been erased or integrated or occupied, I see their faces in my memory and I remember teaching their stories as lessons in necessary compromise. He moved closer, his voice intense. And because you, a human who has been in this galaxy for barely a fraction of my lifespan, saw what I chose not to see, you asked questions I was afraid to ask. You valued truth over comfort. If our civilization has any hope of actually becoming what it claims to be, it needs more people like you, not fewer. But I'm just one student, Kayla protested. What can I possibly do against a system that spans thousands of worlds? I don't know, Velcor admitted. But I know what happens if you do nothing. The system continues. More species are integrated. More cultures are erased. More students are taught that power equals righteousness and consensus equals truth. The cycle continues forever. Kayla stood up, pacing in the small space of the privacy field. There are other humans at the academy, not many but a few dozen across different programs. If I tell them what I've found, if we start asking questions together, they'll shut you down faster, Velcor interrupted. Organized resistance is dealt with more harshly than individual dissent. The Kraviks tried to organize resistance. You know what happened to them. So I'm supposed to what? Keep quiet? Pretend I don't know? No, Velcor said firmly. You're supposed to be strategic. The Council's power comes from control of information and control of narrative. They can monitor communications, restrict archives, threaten individuals. But they can't prevent independent thought. They can't stop people from noticing patterns once those patterns are pointed out. He pulled up another holographic display, this one showing a network diagram. There are others like you. Not many, but some. Students and faculty who have noticed inconsistencies, species representatives who resent their treatment, but feel powerless to resist. Even some council members who are troubled by certain decisions but lack evidence to challenge the consensus. You want me to organize a resistance? Kayla said slowly. I want you to plant seeds, Velcor corrected. Subtle ones. Ask questions in class that make other students think. Share research that highlights inconsistencies. Make connections with those who are already questioning. The council can suppress open rebellion, but they can't suppress thousands of individual minds starting to doubt. Kayla thought about this for a long moment. It made sense in a way, but it also felt impossibly dangerous and painfully slow. How long would that take? How many more species get destroyed while we're planting seeds? I don't know, Velcor said honestly. Perhaps many. Perhaps the system is too entrenched to ever really change. Perhaps we'll both be expelled or worse for even having this conversation. His color shifted to something softer. But I know that doing nothing guarantees the continuation of injustice. At least this way, there's a chance. Kayla looked at the reports floating in the holographic display. Decades of manipulation, centuries of erasure, thousands of years of carefully maintained control. The scale of it was overwhelming. She thought about her grandmother's words about speaking truth to power even when it seemed futile. Okay, she said finally. I'll be strategic. I'll be careful. But I won't stop asking questions. I wouldn't expect anything less, Velcor said. Now, there's one more thing you need to see. He pulled up a final document, this one heavily encrypted. This is a communication I intercepted from Council Security. It's a proposal being debated next month. Kayla read the title and felt her blood turn to ice. Accelerated Integration Protocol. Earth. They're discussing whether humanity's ideological contamination risk has become too high, Velcor explained. If approved, the protocol would place Earth under Council protection, which is their term for occupation. Your planet would lose sovereignty. Human governments would become advisory bodies with no real power. Education would be completely overhauled to align with Council standards. They're talking about conquering Earth, Kayla said, her voice barely above a whisper. They're talking about protecting the galaxy from human ideas, Velcor said. From their perspective, it's the same thing. Your species' tendency to question authority, to resist consensus, to value individual rights over collective stability. They see it as a virus that needs to be contained before it spreads. Kayla sat back down, her legs suddenly weak. Everything she'd been doing, all her questions and research, had been personal, academic, an attempt to understand injustice and maybe help a few individuals. But this was bigger. This was about Earth's future, humanity's freedom, everything her species might become. When is the vote? She asked. 6 months, Velcor said. The proposal needs approval from all 7 council seats. Right now it has support from 4, including the Kryn representative. The others are undecided. Can we stop it? I don't know, Velcor admitted. But I know that the council fears exposure more than anything. Their power depends on the belief that they are wise, just, and necessary. If enough species started questioning that belief, started seeing the patterns of manipulation and control, the consensus might crack. Kayla stood up, her fear transforming into something else. Determination, maybe, or just anger. Then we have 6 months to crack it. Velcor's color shifted to something that might have been approval or might have been concern. Remember what I said about being strategic? The council is watching you. One wrong move and they'll remove you from the board entirely. I understand, Kayla said, but I also understand that sometimes the only way to fight a system designed to suppress truth is to make the truth impossible to ignore. She left the archive with her mind spinning with possibilities and dangers. The campus outside seemed different now, less like a school and more like a battlefield. Every student, every professor, every administrative building was part of a system designed to maintain control through the illusion of education. But illusions only worked if people believed in them. And Kayla was about to become very good at pointing out the cracks. Advanced Interspecies Conflict Resolution met in a smaller auditorium than Professor Velcor's ethics class, but the atmosphere was somehow more oppressive. Professor Thane, a Corvin with deep purple skin and tentacles that moved in constant hypnotic patterns, had a reputation for rigid adherence to protocol. Students who challenged her teachings rarely passed the course. Kayla entered quietly, choosing a seat in the middle of the room rather than her usual spot in the back. Being too visible or too invisible both attracted attention, and she needed to navigate carefully now. Around her, students from 24 species settled into their seats, their conversations dying as Professor Thane activated the central holographic display. Today's case study, Thane began, her voice carrying the clicking harmonics of her species' language. Through the universal translator, concerns the Tyrillian intervention of cycle 2847. The Tyrillians were a developing species that had achieved industrial technology but not spaceflight. Council observers detected troubling patterns in their social development. Images appeared showing a world similar to Earth, cities gleaming beside natural landscapes. Then images of violence, protests, conflicts between different Tyrillian factions. The Tyrillians were fragmenting into ideological groups, Thane continued. Religious extremism, nationalist movements, competing economic systems. Council analysis predicted a 78% probability of self-destruction within 2 generations. The question before us, was the Council justified in intervening? A Threxian student raised multiple arms. Of course they were justified. The preservation of sentient life is the highest ethical priority. Allowing a species to destroy itself when intervention could prevent it would be immoral. Excellent, Thane said approvingly. What form did the intervention take? The Council sent cultural advisors, a Zentari student answered. They helped the Tyrillians establish a unified global government based on consensus principles. They provided technology to eliminate resource scarcity. They educated Tyrillian leaders in ethical governance. Within 50 cycles, the Tyrillians were stable enough to join the galactic community. Murmurs of approval swept through the class. Professor Thane's tentacles waved in a pattern indicating satisfaction. A textbook example of beneficial intervention. The Tyrillians today are productive members of galactic society, grateful for the guidance that saved their species. Kayla raised her hand slowly. Every eye in the room turned to her. She could feel the weight of Professor Thane's attention like a physical pressure. Yes, Student Morrison? Thane's tone was carefully neutral, but Kayla heard the warning underneath. I have a question about the Tyrillian perspective, Kayla said carefully. Do we have records of what the Tyrillians themselves thought about the intervention at the time? The Tyrillians were divided, Thane replied. Some resisted, others welcomed Council assistance. As is common with developing species, they lacked the broader perspective necessary to understand what was best for them. But we do have their records? Kayla pressed gently. Documentation of Tyrillian voices from that period. The archives contain some materials, Thane said, her tentacles beginning to move in more agitated patterns. Though they must be understood in context, developing species often fail to comprehend the complexities of galactic civilization. Could we examine those material? Shh, Kayla asked. It might be educational to hear the Tyrillian perspective, even if we ultimately conclude the Council was correct. Several students shifted uncomfortably. The Threxian who had spoken earlier made a sound of irritation. What would be the point? We already know the intervention was successful. Why waste time on the confused opinions of primitives who didn't understand what was happening? Kayla turned to face the Threxian directly, keeping her voice mild. Because understanding how intervention is experienced by those being intervened upon might help us conduct future interventions more effectively. If we know what causes resistance or resentment, we can address those factors. It was a careful argument, framing her request in terms that supported the system rather than challenged it. Professor Thane's tentacles slowed their agitation slightly. An interesting point, Thane admitted reluctantly. Very well. I will display selected excerpts from Tyrillian records of that period. But remember, these are the words of beings who lacked full understanding of the situation. The holographic display shifted, showing text in Tyrillian script with translated subtitles. Kayla had already read these records in the deep archives, but most of her classmates hadn't. The words that appeared made several students visibly uncomfortable. They came as friends, one excerpt read, but they reshaped our entire civilization without our consent. Our religions were called primitive. Our governments were called inefficient. Our art was called unsophisticated. Everything we were, everything our ancestors built, was dismissed as the confused efforts of children who needed guidance. Another excerpt. The Council advisors speak of preserving our species, but they are destroying our culture. They decide what we learn, how we govern, what we value. We are becoming a pale copy of galactic civilization rather than a unique expression of Tyrillian identity. They save our bodies but erase our souls. The room had gone very quiet. Professor Thane's tentacles had frozen in place, a sign of stress in her species. As you can see, she said finally, her voice strained, the Tyrillians were deeply confused about the benefits being provided to them. They focused on superficial concerns about cultural preservation, while missing the larger picture of species survival. But Professor, a small voice spoke up from the back. A Valorian student that Kayla didn't know well. That second excerpt mentions that the council decided what they learned. Did the intervention include controlling Tyrillian education? Standard procedure, Thane said quickly. Developing species often teach their young harmful ideologies or factually incorrect information. The council provided updated curricula based on established knowledge. So the council decided what counted as truth, the Valorian continued, her voice growing stronger. They decided which Tyrillian traditions were worth preserving, and which should be eliminated. They decided how Tyrillian society should be structured. She paused. How is that different from conquest? The room erupted, half the class shouting down the Valorian, others suddenly finding questions of their own. Professor Thane's tentacles thrashed in patterns indicating severe distress. Order, Thane commanded. The comparison to conquest is offensive and demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of council benevolence. The Tyrillians were not conquered. They were guided. Guided at gunpoint, Kayla said quietly but loud enough to be heard. She pulled up another document on her datapad, projecting it to the shared display. This is a council military report from the intervention. 3 Tyrillian cities were bombarded when their populations refused to accept council advisors. 40,000 casualties were classified as regrettable but necessary to establish authority. Professor Thane's color had shifted to a deep, angry purple. Student Morrison, you are disrupting this class with inflammatory materials taken out of context. The military actions were defensive responses to terrorist attacks on council personnel. The report calls them terrorist attacks, Kayla agreed. But the Tyrillian records call them resistance movements defending their sovereignty. Who decides which term is correct? The council decides, Thane said firmly. That is the entire purpose of having a galactic authority. Someone must make final determinations about truth and justice. But what if the council is wrong? The Valorian student asked. What if they're not benevolent guides but just another empire claiming moral authority for their conquests? Enough. Thane's tentacles slammed against her desk, creating a sound like thunder. This class is about learning proper intervention protocols, not debating the legitimacy of council authority. Student Morrison, Student Kalara, you will both report to Dean Korthax's office immediately after class. Your disruptive behavior will not be tolerated. But the damage was already done. Students were whispering to each other, pulling up their own datapads to research. The comfortable consensus that had filled the room at the start of class had fractured. Kayla saw it in their faces, the sudden uncertainty, the questions forming behind their eyes. The rest of the class proceeded in tense silence. Professor Thane lectured about proper intervention procedures, but Kayla noticed that fewer students were taking notes than usual. More were conducting quiet searches on their devices, chasing down references to other interventions, other conquered species rebranded as saved civilizations. When class ended, Kayla and the Valorian student Kalara walked together toward the dean's office. In the hallway, 3 more students approached them cautiously. Is it true? One of them asked, a young Zentari who looked nervous. About the Tyrillians? About the council using force? It's documented in official records, Kayla said. Anyone can access them if they know where to look. Could you show us? Another student asked. How to access the deep archives? Kayla was about to respond when Kalara touched her arm gently. Careful, the Valorian whispered. We're being watched, she was right. A security drone hovered nearby, its sensors obviously recording their conversation. Kayla nodded slightly. I'm sure your research skills are advanced enough to find what you're looking for. The archive directory system is quite comprehensive if you use the right search terms. The students understood, exchanging glances before dispersing. Kayla and Kalara continued toward their summons, neither speaking until they were alone. Thank you for backing me up in there, Kayla said quietly. I should be thanking you, Kalara replied. Her skin had paled to an almost white color, indicating fear. The Valorians were one of the species that experienced benevolent intervention. My grandmother told me stories when I was young, but I thought they were exaggerations. Resentment about necessary changes, she paused. After your presentation in Professor Velkor's class, I started reading the archives. My grandmother wasn't exaggerating. She was understating what happened to us. I'm sorry, Kayla said. Don't be, Kalara said firmly. I'm angry that I had to hear the truth from a human instead of from my own people, but I'm grateful that someone finally said it out loud. She glanced at the security drone following them at a discreet distance. What do you think they'll do to us? Threaten us, probably, Kayla said. Try to scare us into silence. Maybe expulsion if we're unlucky. And if we are expelled, then we go home and tell everyone what we learned, Kayla said simply. They can control what happens in the academy, but they can't control what we do after we leave. They reached the dean's office and were immediately ushered inside. Dean Korthak sat behind his desk, but he wasn't alone. Two other figures stood near the windows. A Kryn military advisor in formal armor, and someone Kayla didn't recognize, a species she'd never seen before, with skin that seemed to shift between solid and liquid states. Student Morrison, Korthak said, his voice colder than it had been during their previous meeting. I warned you about further disruptions. You chose not to heed that warning. I was participating in class discussion, Kayla said. Professor Thane asked us to consider an intervention case. I asked questions about it. You introduced inflammatory materials designed to undermine respect for council authority, the Kryn advisor said, stepping forward. Your pattern of behavior suggests intentional ideological subversion. The shifting figure spoke for the first time, its voice like water flowing over rocks. We represent council security. Student Morrison, Student Kalara. You are both being placed under formal investigation for activities contrary to galactic stability. Kayla felt her heart sink, but she kept her expression neutral. Kalara beside her had gone completely white with fear. What does that mean exactly? Kayla asked. It means, Dean Korthak said heavily, that your academic careers are suspended pending investigation. It means your communications will be monitored in full. It means you will not attend classes, access archives, or interact with other students until this matter is resolved. He paused. It also means that reports will be filed with your respective home governments regarding your conduct. The threat was clear. Earth would be notified that one of its students was causing problems, was being subversive, was potentially endangering humanity's position in the galactic community. Kayla thought about her advisor's warning before she left Earth. Don't make waves. She'd made waves. The question now was whether those waves would become a tide. The isolation quarters were comfortable enough. A small apartment with basic amenities, a window overlooking the academy gardens, and absolutely no way to communicate with the outside world. Kayla's datapad had been confiscated. Her access to the network was blocked. Even the door was controlled remotely, opening only to deliver meals or for scheduled interrogation sessions. She had been confined for 5 days when the first interrogation began. The council security officer who questioned her was the same shifting figure from Dean Korthak's office. It introduced itself as Investigator Thoros and spoke in that strange water-over-rocks voice that made every question sound like a threat. Student Morrison, let us be direct, Thoros began, its form rippling with patterns Kayla couldn't interpret. We know you have been accessing restricted archives. We know you have been communicating with marginalized species groups. We know you have been deliberately undermining trust in council authority. What we need to understand is who is directing you. No one is directing me, Kayla said for what felt like the 100th time. I'm a student. I read archives because that's what students do. I asked questions because that's what education is supposed to encourage. Human students do not typically access files on extinct species integration protocols, Thoros said. Human students do not typically research council military interventions from centuries past. Human students do not typically coordinate disruptions across multiple classes with other students. It leaned forward, its form becoming more solid. Someone trained you in what to look for. Someone provided you with search parameters. Who? I taught myself, Kayla insisted. I'm curious. I notice patterns. That's not a crime. Curiosity that threatens galactic stability becomes a crime, Thoros replied. Your actions have consequences beyond yourself. Already, we are seeing increased research activity into sensitive topics. Students questioning established teachings. Faculty members requesting access to restricted files. Its voice hardened. You have infected this academy with doubt. That infection must be contained. The interrogations continued for hours each day. Always the same questions. Always the same implications that Kayla must be part of some larger conspiracy. The idea that one human student could simply notice inconsistencies on her own seemed incomprehensible to them. On the 8th day, they changed tactics. A new interrogator arrived, a Zentari psychologist named Mirana. She was gentle, sympathetic, offering Kayla refreshments and speaking in soft tones. I understand this must be difficult, Mirana said, settling into a chair across from Kayla. You came here hoping to learn, to contribute to galactic society. Instead, you've been caught up in something larger than yourself. I'm not caught up in anything, Kayla said wearily. I just ask questions. Questions that challenged the very foundation of our civilization, Mirana countered gently. Surely you can see how that would be concerning. The Council has maintained peace for thousands of years. That peace is fragile. It depends on shared understanding, mutual trust, acceptance of established authority. She paused. Your questions threaten that peace. So peace is more important than truth? Kayla asked. Sometimes yes, Mirana said simply. If the truth destabilizes billions of beings, if it leads to conflict and suffering, then perhaps some truths are better left unexamined. Kayla stared at the psychologist, trying to understand if she actually believed what she was saying. You're asking me to accept that ignorance is better than knowledge, that lies are preferable to facts. I'm asking you to consider the broader implications of your actions, Mirana said. You've planted seeds of doubt in young minds. Those seeds will grow. Students will question their teachers. Citizens will question their governments. Species will question the council. Where does that lead? Maybe to a better system, Kayla suggested. Maybe to accountability. Maybe to actual ethics instead of convenient ones. Or maybe to chaos, Mirana countered. The last time the Council's authority was seriously challenged, the resulting conflicts killed trillions. The fracture wars nearly destroyed galactic civilization. It took centuries to rebuild trust and establish the system we have now. Her voice grew more intense. We cannot allow that to happen again. We will not allow it. So you'll suppress anyone who asks questions? You'll isolate and threaten students who notice that your perfect system is built on lies? If necessary, yes, Mirana said calmly. The needs of trillions outweigh the rights of individuals. That is the fundamental principle of galactic ethics. Kayla laughed bitterly. That's not ethics. That's just utilitarianism wielded as a weapon. And history has shown both on Earth and apparently across the galaxy that sacrificing individuals for the collective good has a way of expanding until there are no individuals left to sacrifice. Mirana stood up, her sympathy evaporating. You are not helping yourself, Student Morrison. We are offering you a way out. Admit you were manipulated. Provide names of anyone who encouraged your investigations. Accept re-education on proper scholarly conduct. Do these things and you can return to your studies. Re-education, Kayla repeated. You mean brainwashing? We mean helping you understand perspectives you currently lack, Mirana said coldly. The alternative is expulsion and deportation to Earth, with a formal notation that you are a security risk. Such a notation would make it very difficult for other humans to gain admission to galactic institutions. Your entire species' educational opportunities could be restricted because of your actions. The threat hung in the air between them. Kayla felt the weight of it like a physical force. She wasn't just risking her own future now. She was potentially harming every human who came after her, every student who dreamed of studying among the stars. Can I think about it? She asked quietly. You have 24 hours, Mirana said. After that, the decision will be made for you. When Mirana left, Kayla sat alone in her quarters, staring out at the garden below. She could see other students walking between classes, their lives continuing normally while hers had been put on hold. How many of them were questioning things now because of what she'd started? How many were being monitored, investigated, threatened? The door chimed. Kayla expected another interrogator, but instead a cleaning drone entered. It moved through the room in the standard pattern, but as it passed her desk, something fell from its underside. A small data crystal no bigger than a fingernail. Kayla's heart raced. She picked up the crystal carefully, glancing at the security cameras in the corners of the room. But the cleaning drone had positioned itself to block their view. Deliberate. She palmed the crystal and waited. The drone finished its work and left. Kayla examined the crystal closely. It was unmarked, encrypted, and obviously not supposed to be there. A message from someone on the outside. But who and how could she read it without access to a datapad? She spent the next hour examining her quarters more carefully. The room was comfortable but sterile, designed to prevent any unauthorized communication or research. But as she searched, her hand brushed against the wall panel near the window. It shifted slightly. Kayla pushed harder and a small compartment opened. Inside was an ancient datapad, probably left from before the room was converted to isolation quarters. It was decades old, running on obsolete software, but it was functional. More importantly, it wasn't connected to the Academy's network, which meant it wouldn't be monitored. She inserted the crystal and held her breath. The screen flickered to life, displaying a message in plain text. "Student Morrison, this is Professor Velcor. I am being monitored and cannot contact you directly. The cleaning drone was programmed by a sympathetic technician. You need to know what is happening outside your confinement. Your questioning has had effects far beyond the Academy. The recordings of your class disruptions were copied and distributed before they could be suppressed. They have spread to 16 different worlds. Students at other institutions are accessing the archives you referenced. Faculty members are being asked questions they cannot answer." Kayla read on, her pulse quickening. "The council is alarmed. They are convening an emergency session to discuss the human ideology problem. The proposal to place Earth under protection protocols has been moved up for immediate consideration. They see your influence spreading and want to contain it at the source." Her blood ran cold. Because of her actions, Earth was in danger. Her entire species might lose its freedom because she couldn't keep quiet. But Velcor's message continued. "However, there is also resistance forming. Council members from species that were forcibly integrated are asking for investigations into historical interventions. The Valdor survivors have formally petitioned for their case to be reopened. 3 minor species have submitted complaints about current occupation protocols. Your questions have not just created problems for the Council. They have created opportunities for accountability." Kayla read the final paragraph twice. "You are being given a choice tomorrow. Accept re-education or face expulsion. Both options serve the Council's interests. Re-education silences you through compliance. Expulsion silences you through removal and threatens other humans into compliance. There is a third option. Refuse both. Demand a public hearing under academic freedom protocols. Force them to state their charges against you openly, in front of the entire student body and faculty. Make them defend their actions in the light, rather than in shadows. It is dangerous. They may still expel you, but it will not be quiet. The proceedings will be recorded, distributed, discussed. Even your defeat could advance the cause of truth." The message ended with coordinates to a secure communication channel and a final line. "Whatever you decide, know that you have already changed something. The question is whether that change dies with your silence or grows despite their opposition. Choose wisely. You carry more than just your own future now." Kayla deleted the message and hid the datapad back in its compartment. She lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about impossible choices. Accept re-education and become a tool of the system she opposed. Accept expulsion and leave the Academy, potentially endangering other humans but at least keeping her principles intact. Or demand a public hearing and force the Council to show their hand openly. The safe choice was expulsion. Go home to Earth, warn people there about what the Council really was, and let others fight this battle. She had done enough. She had asked the questions. She had planted the seeds. Someone else could water them. But Kayla thought about the Valdor student's message. "Thank you for remembering us." She thought about the Tyrillians, the melodic spheres, the Kravex, all the species that had been erased or integrated or occupied. She thought about the students who were just now starting to question, who needed someone to stand openly rather than whisper in shadows. She thought about her grandmother, who had fought against corrupt governments on Earth, who had been imprisoned twice for speaking truth to power, who had told young Kayla that silence in the face of injustice was itself a form of injustice. By the time Marana returned 24 hours later, Kayla had made her decision. When the psychologist asked for her answer, Kayla stood up straight and spoke clearly. "I invoke Academic Freedom Protocol 17. I demand a public hearing to address the charges against me. I demand the right to present evidence and call witnesses. I demand that any judgment against me be made openly, with full transparency in accordance with the Academy's own charter." Mirana's expression hardened. You're making a mistake. Maybe, Kayla agreed, but I'm making it publicly. If the council wants to silence me, they'll have to do it where everyone can see. Marana stood silently for a long moment, then nodded curtly. Very well. Your hearing will be scheduled. I hope you understand what you've just done. I do, Kayla said quietly. I've forced them to choose between their principles and their power. Either they prove my charges false with evidence, or they reveal themselves as exactly what I've claimed they are. Either outcome serves truth better than silence. After Marana left, Kayla sat down, her hands shaking with delayed fear. She had just guaranteed that whatever happened next would happen in front of the entire academy. She had turned her individual confrontation with authority into a test case for the entire. The hearing had been adjourned 3 hours ago, but the chaos it unleashed continued to spread. Students gathered in courtyards and common areas, debating everything from historical interventions to the nature of authority itself. Faculty members who had taught unchallenged for decades suddenly found themselves defending positions they had never questioned. The Academy's network system struggled under the load of thousands of simultaneous archive searches as students investigated the claims Kayla had made. Kayla herself sat in a small conference room, waiting. Dean Korthax had called for a recess to deliberate, but that had been hours ago with no word. Professor Velcor sat with her, along with Kalara and a handful of other students who had spoken up during the hearing. They weren't supposed to gather like this, but the normal rules seemed to have dissolved in the wake of what happened. They're arguing about what to do with you, Velcor said quietly, his form cycling through anxious colors. The panel is divided. Some want immediate expulsion to make an example. Others fear that expelling you now would validate everything you said. Maybe they'll compromise and just make me disappear, Kayla said, attempting humor but not quite managing it. That's not funny, Kalara said sharply. The Kravex joked about disappearing too before they actually did. The door opened suddenly, making everyone jump. But it wasn't Dean Korthax or security. It was a group of students Kayla didn't recognize from species she'd barely heard of. The one in front, a being that looked like living mercury, spoke in rapid clicks that the translator rendered as urgent. Student Morrison, we need to tell you something. My species, the Liquidians, were small. Only a few million of us left. The council says we're protected, kept safe on our home world. But it's not protection. It's a prison. The mercury being seemed to pulse with emotion. After your hearing, I contacted my family. I asked them questions I never asked before. They told me things that aren't in any official record. My people had space travel once. We explored 3 systems before the council found us. They said we were too primitive to manage ourselves, too vulnerable to survive without guidance. They grounded our ships, dismantled our technology, and put us under protection protocols. Another student stepped forward, a harmonic collective member whose voice came through a translation device. My people sang across the stars. Our consciousness existed in wave patterns that spanned light years. The council said we were incomprehensible, potentially dangerous. They forced us into physical bodies, constrained us to single planets, told us it was for the safety of material species. We forgot how to sing the old songs. They say only a dozen of the ancient ones remember, and they're dying. More students crowded into the room, each with a story, each with a revelation about their people's true history. Species after species that had been integrated, protected, guided, and in the process lost something fundamental about who they were. Professor Velcor listened, his crystalline form growing dimmer with each testimony. I taught all of you, he said finally, his voice hollow. I taught your species' histories as examples of successful integration. I never knew. I never asked. None of us asked, a Tyrillian student said. We were taught not to. Questioning was disrespectful to the ancestors who sacrificed for our survival. Challenging was ungrateful for the council's wisdom. We learned to accept rather than investigate. The door opened again, and this time it was Dean Korthax, flanked by security drones. His expression was unreadable. Student Morrison, the panel has reached a decision. Everyone else needs to leave immediately. No, Kalara said, standing up. Whatever you're going to do to her, you do in front of witnesses. That's what public accountability means. This is not your concern, Student Kalara, Korthax said coldly. It's everyone's concern, the mercury being said. That's what Student Morrison taught us. When injustice happens to one, it threatens all. More students had gathered in the hallway behind Korthax. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Word had spread. Whatever happened next would not happen in private. Korthax looked at the crowd, then back at Kayla. Something shifted in his expression. Resignation, maybe. Or perhaps respect. Very well. The panel has deliberated extensively. The charges of disruptive conduct and unauthorized research are dropped due to insufficient evidence that Academy protocols were violated. Relief flooded through Kayla, but she waited for the other shoe to drop. However, Korthax continued, the charge of ideological subversion remains. The panel has determined that while your research was technically permitted, your interpretation of that research and your presentation of conclusions designed to undermine council authority constitute a violation of Academy standards regarding responsible scholarship. Responsible scholarship, Kayla repeated. You mean scholarship that reaches approved conclusions? We mean scholarship that considers broader context and demonstrates appropriate respect for established institutions, Korthax said. The panel offers you a choice. Accept a formal censure, agree to supervised research protocols for the remainder of your education, and commit to avoiding further public challenges to council authority. Or face expulsion with notification to Earth government that you were removed for conduct unbecoming of a galactic scholar. The room went deadly quiet. It was the same choice as before, just wrapped in more formal language. Submit or leave. Kayla looked around at the faces watching her. Students who had found their voices because she had found hers. Faculty members who were questioning their own teachings. A system that was finally, painfully being forced to examine itself. I reject both options, she said clearly. I will not accept censure for doing what education demands. I will not submit to supervision designed to limit my pursuit of truth. And I will not be silent about injustice because silence is convenient. Korthax's skin pattern shifted to angry darkness. Then you leave us no choice. You are hereby expelled from— Wait, a new voice interrupted. A counselor stepped through the crowd, her robes marking her as a representative of the governing body itself. Kayla recognized the species insignia. She was Valdor, one of the survivors. Dean Korthax, I invoke council oversight authority. This hearing has raised questions that exceed Academy jurisdiction. Korthax looked genuinely shocked. Counselor Thessa, this is an internal Academy matter. It stopped being internal when thousands of students began demanding investigations into historical integration protocols, Thessa replied. Her voice carried the weight of immense age and deeper grief. It stopped being internal when representatives from 40 species petitioned the council for answers about their people's histories. It stopped being internal when this student forced us to choose between transparency and tyranny. She moved to stand beside Kayla on the platform. I am Valdor. My species was nearly destroyed in a war justified by ethical philosophy taught at this academy. For decades, I have sat in council chambers and watched that pattern repeat. Watched other species question, resist, and ultimately submit or perish. I said nothing because I was afraid. Afraid for the few thousand Valdor who remain. Afraid that challenging the council would finish what the Kryn started. Her voice grew stronger. But this human child, this student who has been in our galaxy for barely a moment, had the courage I lacked. She asked whose ethics we were using. She demanded accountability from those who claim moral authority. She refused to accept convenient lies in place of difficult truths. Thessa turned to address the assembled students. The council will convene an emergency session to address the questions raised at this hearing. We will examine integration protocols. We will investigate claims of corruption in historical decisions. We will allow species representatives to present their own narratives, not just the official versions written by victors. You can't promise that, Korthax protested. The council will never agree to— The council has no choice, Thessa interrupted. The recordings of this hearing have been transmitted to every major institution in 16 systems. Students across the galaxy are asking the same questions Student Morrison asked. Faculty members are requesting access to the same archives she accessed. We can either address these questions openly or watch our authority crumble as more beings realize it was never built on truth in the first place. She looked back at Kayla. You will not be expelled. You will be granted unrestricted archive access to continue your research, and you will be invited to present your findings to the council when they convene to examine integration protocols. Thessa's expression softened. Your grandmother would be proud, I think. She fought her government's corruption on Earth. You fight ours across the stars. Kayla felt tears sting her eyes. You know about my grandmother? I know about humans, Thessa said gently. I've watched your species for 15 years, wondering if you would conform to our system or challenge it, wondering if you would learn our mistakes or repeat your own. Today I have my answer. She raised her voice so everyone could hear. Humans remember being conquered. They remember empires that called subjugation civilization. They recognize the patterns because they lived through them. That memory, that recognition, that refusal to accept comfortable lies. That is what our galaxy needs. Not to destroy the Council, but to remake it into something actually worthy of its authority. Professor Velcor stepped forward, his crystalline form blazing with light. I wish to formally propose a curriculum reform, that all students be required to engage with primary sources including accounts from integrated species, that critical analysis replace consensus acceptance as the foundation of ethical education, that we teach beings to question rather than merely to obey. Murmurs of agreement swept through the assembled students, and several faculty members nodded. Dean Corthax looked around at faces that no longer showed him the automatic deference he expected. His authority, built on unchallenged tradition, was evaporating before his eyes. "This is chaos," he said weakly. "This is the destruction of everything we've built." "No," Kayla said quietly. "This is accountability. This is what happens when power is finally forced to justify itself. It's uncomfortable, it's messy, and it won't be quick or easy. But it's necessary." She looked out at the thousands of students watching her, beings from hundreds of species who had come to this academy to learn. Education should teach us to seek truth, not to accept authority. Ethics should be about examining right and wrong, not about justifying predetermined conclusions. And justice should mean accountability for everyone, especially those who claim to speak for it. The crowd erupted in noise, arguments, and agreements, mixing together in dozens of languages. Dean Corthax tried once more to assert control, but his voice was lost in the tumult. The hearing was over, but something much larger had begun. In the days that followed, the changes spread like ripples across a pond. Students formed committees to investigate their own species' integration histories. Faculty members began openly questioning curriculum materials they had taught unchallenged for decades. Archive access restrictions were challenged and, in many cases, removed. The comfortable consensus that had defined the Academy for centuries fractured into 1,000 debates about truth, power, and justice. The Council's emergency session, when it finally convened 3 months later, lasted for 6 weeks. Species representatives presented evidence of forced integration, cultural destruction, and systematic erasure of inconvenient histories. Counselors who had benefited from the old system found themselves defending positions that sounded increasingly indefensible when exposed to light. Several members resigned rather than face investigation. Others committed to reform with genuine conviction. The accelerated integration protocol for Earth was not just rejected, it was held up as an example of the kind of thinking that needed to end. Humanity was formally guaranteed sovereignty and given additional protections against Council interference. Other species whose integrations had been forced were offered the chance to renegotiate their status, to reclaim stolen autonomy, to rebuild what had been destroyed. It wasn't perfect. Many in the Council resisted change. Many species found that their cultures had been so damaged that full restoration was impossible. Many injustices were too old, too complete to ever be fully addressed. But the conversation had changed. The questions were being asked. The patterns were being recognized. Kayla Morrison completed her education at the Academy with full honors. Her thesis, Ethical Authority and Historical Accountability, Examining Integration Protocols Through Primary Sources, became required reading for every ethics student in the galaxy. She was offered positions with dozens of institutions, but she chose to return to Earth. On her last day at the Academy, Professor Velcor found her packing in her quarters. His crystalline form was a warm amber, a color she had learned indicated affection and respect. "You're truly leaving?" he asked. "Earth needs scholars who understand how galactic systems actually work," Kayla said. "And the galaxy needs humans who remember what it's like to be on the receiving end of benevolent tyranny. We can teach each other, but only if I go home and prepare my people for what's really out here." "You changed this place," Velcor said simply. One student asking honest questions changed everything. One student couldn't have done anything if there weren't thousands ready to listen, Kayla corrected. The questions were always there, I just asked them out loud. She finished packing and stood at her window one last time, looking out at the academy grounds where thousands of students were learning to question, to investigate, to hold power accountable. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. And better was how progress began. As her ship lifted off from Centauri Prime hours later, Kayla thought about her grandmother, about the long fight for justice that spanned generations and now spanned stars. She thought about the Valdor student's message that had meant so much. Thank you for remembering us. She hadn't just remembered. She had made it impossible for anyone else to forget. And in a galaxy that had built its peace on carefully maintained amnesia, that was perhaps the most revolutionary act possible. The ship's computer chimed, informing her they were leaving the system. Kayla pulled up a message she had received that morning from Counselor Thessa. It was short. You asked whose ethics we were using. For thousands of years we used the ethics of power pretending to be wisdom. Because of you, we must now face the uncomfortable work of developing ethics that are actually ethical. Thank you for shattering our comfortable lies. The galaxy is better for the pieces you broke and the truth you revealed. Kayla smiled and looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there, other species were being integrated. Other students were being taught convenient lies. Other injustices were waiting to be discovered. The work wasn't finished. It would never be finished. But at least now, someone was asking whose ethics they were using. And that question, once asked, could never be fully silenced again.